September 2, 1946, Fort Dix, New Jersey, 6:23 a.m. A U.S. Army truck idled beside the depot gates, exhaust curling in the cool morning air. Inside sat Lieutenant Ivan Orlov, a Soviet POW who had survived German captivity, fallen in love with an American soldier, and now awaited repatriation to a country that called him a traitor. Two Soviet officers climbed into the cab. Ivan turned once, looked toward the horizon, and whispered, "Tell her I chose freedom." Within minutes, the truck rolled out and he vanished forever. What followed wasn't just a mystery. It was the untold story of how America became the only nation in history powerful enough to defeat its enemies with kindness, and how that kindness was dangerous enough to make tyrants tremble. The Bride and the Gulag, July 1946. The summer air over Camp Dix, New Jersey, smelled of motor oil and hot asphalt. Corporal June Barrett, 23, stood in her pressed khaki uniform beside a Soviet prisoner who refused to call himself a prisoner. His name was Lieutenant Ivan Orlov, Red Army mechanic, captured by Germans in 1942, transferred through a dozen camps, and finally delivered into American custody when the war ended. He wore a freshly laundered fatigue jacket, sleeves rolled high. "In America," he whispered, "the sun doesn't fear the guards." She smiled, unaware those words might be his last free ones. Their marriage was small, half-secret, witnessed by two GIs from the Motor Transport Battalion and a chaplain from Fort Dix's 1st Service Command. Outside, Jeep MB engines idled while a B-17 from nearby Fort Dix Airfield roared overhead a mechanical hymn to victory. Just a year earlier, American factories like Willow Run had been turning out a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. In Detroit, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal had delivered 25,000 M4 Sherman tanks, each 30 tons of rolling steel powered by the same engines that once ran sedans. Those machines won the war, the values behind them won hearts. June met Ivan while filing maintenance logs for the 702nd Truck Company, which oversaw captured equipment repair. The camp held 3,000 POWs over 700 acres, and the army assigned work according to skill. Ivan, who had kept a T-34 running on frozen beet oil in Smolensk, now fixed American trucks with a smile that unsettled his guards. He looked like freedom wearing grease, one sergeant recalled in a report. When victory parades ended and troop trains rolled home, the world assumed every foreign soldier would too. But Stalin's orders were clear: any Soviet who had surrendered was a traitor. Allied officers called the coming process Operation Keelhaul Repatriation by Force. Soviet liaison officers arrived in polished Zis-5 trucks, demanding access to their men. The Americans saw fear spread faster than rumor. According to a declassified War Department memo dated August 30th, 1946, several Russian nationals expressed desire to remain in U.S. custody indefinitely rather than return. Translation: they'd rather face prison here than execution there. June watched Ivan grow quiet. He stopped shaving. He traced maps in dust with a wrench handle, eastward lines that ended at question marks. One evening, he handed her a folded ration card. "Proof I lived free," he said. Inside, he had written, "If I disappear, remember, I chose this side." Weeks later, Soviet officials requested his transfer to a transit center in New York. A captain from the Office of Military Government protested, noting Ivan's pending personal engagement with an American citizen. The reply from Moscow's liaison read, "All Soviet persons return, no exception." September 2nd, 1946, dawned grey and damp. A truck pulled up outside the Fort Dix motor pool. Witnesses saw two men in NKVD uniforms escort Ivan away. One US? Guard swore he heard him shout in English, "Tell June the sky here is wide." That was the last record. The official file ends there, one more vanished name in the chaos of repatriation. But his story reveals a truth that data alone can't hide. While Stalin built gulags for his own soldiers, America built libraries, farms, and families for theirs. A captured mechanic found love, hope, and a taste of vanilla ice cream before tyranny reached across oceans to silence him. June never remarried. Her diary from December 12th reads, "If they took him, they'll never take what made him smile, freedom itself." And that's the real weapon America wielded in 1946. Not the B-29 seconds that flew over Japan, not the Sherman's 75mm gun, but the simple, unstoppable promise that even an enemy could find dignity on American soil. Fat on freedom. The first thing most German prisoners noticed when they reached America wasn't the guards, it was the food. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, The mess hall served white bread, beef stew, and real coffee. Within 3 months, medical reports showed the average German POW had gained 12 pounds. A few even wrote home bragging that they were fatter in defeat than we ever were in victory. Meanwhile, in Soviet repatriation camps across Eastern Europe, men starved while waiting for trains back to Moscow. America's enemies had discovered the most subversive truth of all: freedom tasted better than fear. Across the United States, more than 425,000 enemy POWs lived under the Stars and Stripes. They worked farms, fixed machinery, even played baseball with their guards. In Texas, one German soldier remembered mowing fields beside American farmers who shared cigarettes and jokes in broken English. "They treated us as men," he wrote, "not as animals." By 1945, US camps were producing tons of vegetables and grain so much that the army sent surplus food to war-torn Europe. America fed its prisoners and still fed its allies. No other nation in history had that kind of abundance. Camp Trinidad alone covered 700 acres and held 3,000 prisoners. The barracks had heating, libraries, and even orchestras. When Christmas came, the POW choir performed Silent Night in both English and German. The crowd included GIs, local families, and curious children. One newspaper headline read, "Captured enemies bring peace to a Colorado winter." At the same moment, Soviet screening officers in Poland were shooting returning soldiers for failure to resist capture. The contrast was staggering. America made enemies sing, Stalin made heroes disappear. A War Department inspector named Colonel Clyde Gasser reported in 1946 that Axis prisoners showed improved physical and mental condition due to rations exceeding European civilian standards. In plain words, America's enemies were healthier in captivity than many of its own allies. The Germans called it the land of milk and liberty. Even Japanese officers sent to camps in Kansas wrote astonished letters about baseball games, soap, and sugar. One compared the US camp system to a nation-sized hospital for dignity. The numbers proved it. Every POW in US custody received at least 3,000 calories a day: meat, milk, bread, and vegetables. Each camp had a movie night. They were allowed to write 2 letters a week. Some even studied English using textbooks printed by the army. The Geneva Convention required none of this. America did it anyway, because it believed civilization was measured not by how one treated friends, but how one treated the defeated. When Soviet officers visited US camps to retrieve their nationals, they were stunned. "Why are you fattening our criminals?" one demanded. An American officer answered simply, "Because they're human beings." The visitor shook his head. In Russia, this would be madness. It was more than madness. It was victory by morality. Every meal served in a US mess hall was quiet propaganda, proving democracy could outproduce tyranny and still stay kind. In March of 1946, a German POW named Otto Weber was released from Camp Hearn, Texas. He stepped onto the train platform weighing 185 pounds 57 more than when he arrived. He saluted the American flag and said, "If Germany had fed us like this, we might have fought differently." That same month, Ivan Orlov was still listed as missing during repatriation. June Barrett clipped a newspaper photo of smiling POWs eating ice cream in Texas and wrote beside it, "He could have been one of them." Freedom, in the end, wasn't only an idea. It was 3,000 calories, a full belly, and the chance to laugh at your own defeat. America had proven that compassion could win wars. Next, the men who chose their enemies. In the spring of 1946, American officers at Fort Dix were stunned by a flood of desperate requests from Soviet soldiers. These men, captured during brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, now begged to be reclassified as German. Not because they sympathized with the Nazis, but because returning to Stalin meant torture, exile, or execution. Some even asked to wear Wehrmacht uniforms and be recorded as Prussian volunteers. In one file stamped, "Urgent Confidential," a Soviet sergeant whispered to a chaplain, "Better be your enemy than my country's traitor." Operation Keelhole had begun. Thousands of Soviet citizens, POWs, refugees, even civilians who'd worked in German-occupied territories were rounded up for forced repatriation under the Yalta Agreement. The Allies called it a necessity. Stalin called it justice. The men being loaded into trains called it death. British officers documented how Soviet returnees jumped from moving rail cars or slashed their wrists in holding pens. American guards at Fort Dix watched as repatriation officers arrived with black sedans, cold stares, and lists of names. The air in the camp changed. Laughter stopped. Men disappeared overnight. One of them was Staff Sergeant Alexander Novikov. Captured outside Kharkov in 1943, he survived German captivity by repairing tank engines and memorizing German folk songs to avoid beatings. He reached US custody in Bavaria and was transferred to New Jersey under the Geneva Convention. At Fort Dix, he swept floors, repaired motorbikes, and taught Russian slang to curious guards. He made friends. Then came the interview. When Soviet liaison officers called him in, he arrived in a clean shirt and boots polished with soap. Witnesses said he spoke calmly. "I will not go back," he told them. "I have lived inside a cage once. I will not enter one made of ice." According to the transcript, the Soviets stood, whispered among themselves, then called the Americans into the room. A US captain tried to intervene. It didn't matter. Novikov was gone the next morning. The fear was contagious. Others followed his lead, but in reverse. They claimed to be German, changed names, faked accents. One American lieutenant recounted an Armenian POW begging to be listed as Austrian Volksdeutscher. His eyes, the officer wrote, were the eyes of a man who had seen the hangman's rope and was praying for camouflage. By April, the War Department recorded more than 60 formal requests from Soviet POWs asking to stay in American custody as stateless persons. One file contained a note scrawled in broken English, "Please let me stay prisoner. Prison here is life. Home is not." The enemy, it turned out, wasn't the enemy anymore. American guards began referring to Soviet POWs as the scared ones. A sergeant from the 87th Infantry wrote home, "These Russians would rather be my prisoner than Stalin's soldier." That tells you everything. Soviet officials were furious. One liaison accused the Americans of undermining discipline by being too kind. But kindness wasn't a flaw, it was the weapon Stalin couldn't replicate. He could send tanks, spies, and slogans. America sent cigarettes, food, and warmth. In May, 3 Soviet defectors vanished from Fort Dix. Their official records listed them as repatriated, but whispers spread that one had been sheltered by a Catholic priest, another moved to Pennsylvania farmland, and the third slipped into a new name with help from a US translator. Alexander Novikov was never seen again. But a 1,953 census in Indiana lists a Sasha Nowak, mechanic, born in 1920, with Russian-German ancestry. It may be fiction, it may be truth, but it reflects the greatest victory of all. When freedom is so powerful, men choose their enemy to escape their own nation. Next, Operation Keelhaul. The betrayal America regretted November 1945. In a train yard outside Linz, Austria, US troops watched Soviet officers beat a group of returning prisoners with clubs. Some of the men had just stepped off American trucks. They were former Red Army soldiers, exhausted, unarmed, and betrayed. One screamed, "You promised us safety!" A US lieutenant turned away, sickened. Another wrote in his journal, "This was the only time I felt like I was handing a man to his death with a handshake." The name of this operation? Keelhaul. By the time Operation Keelhaul concluded in 1947, more than 2 million Soviet citizens had been forcibly repatriated, thousands from American custody. They included not only POWs, but also civilians who had fled Soviet rule, anti-communist partisans, and women who had married Allied soldiers. Many were executed upon return. Others were sent to the gulags of Siberia, labeled enemies of the people. Stalin called them traitors. Washington called it protocol. The men themselves called it betrayal. The idea behind Keelhaul was buried in diplomatic ink at Yalta, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. It agreed that all repatriated nationals would return to their home countries, no questions asked. But no one had asked the men. American soldiers watched in horror as screaming refugees were herded into train cars, fists pounding on windows, begging not to be sent east. In a declassified State Department memo dated February 19, 1946, one official wrote, "The moral cost of this program may echo for generations." Among the betrayed was a Soviet defector named Yuri Medvedev. Captured in 1941 near Kiev, he spent years in German labor camps before US forces liberated his group near Munich. Fluent in English, he served as an interpreter for the US 83rd Infantry Division. His commanding officer, Captain James E. Fulbright, said Yuri, was more loyal to our flag than half the soldiers in my unit. When repatriation orders came, Fulbright tried to block the transfer. He wrote to command, This man risked his life to serve us. Sending him back is not justice, it's murder, but justice lost to diplomacy. Medvedev was put on a Soviet convoy at Regensburg. Weeks later, Fulbright received word. Yuri had been sentenced to 25 years in a forced labor camp near Vorkuta. His crime? Collaboration with Western forces. Soviet officers mocked the Americans during these transfers. One colonel reportedly laughed, "You're feeding them ice cream, we'll feed them gravel." Another boasted, "You gave them life, now we'll give them punishment." What shocked US troops most wasn't the violence, it was how calm the Soviets were about it, as if this, too, was war. Some American GIs tried to resist. They forged papers, faked illnesses, hid defectors in supply trucks. A priest in New Jersey gave a Soviet POW sanctuary in his rectory for over a year. A farmer in Nebraska claimed a Russian mechanic as a hired hand and buried his uniform under a chicken coop. These small acts didn't change the policy, but they changed lives. Operation Keelhaul remains one of the least known but most haunting stories of the Second World War's aftermath. America, the nation that beat back fascism with tanks and B-29 seconds, now faced a question no rifle could answer. What do you do when honoring your allies means betraying your values? By the time Ivan Orlov's name appeared on a Soviet transfer manifest in September 1946, the system was already in motion. No appeal, no delay, just a name, a truck, and silence. The priests and the farmers who fought Stalin October 1946. In the basement of a small Catholic church outside Trenton, New Jersey, Father Michael Donnelly lit a candle beside a cot where a Soviet POW named Viktor Sokolov lay shivering. The man had been smuggled out of Fort Dix under the cover of darkness by 2 US guards who refused to watch another defector vanish into Stalin's hand. He was a mechanic, Donnelly later wrote, but he spoke like a man who had rebuilt his own soul. Across America, quiet resistance to Operation Keelhaul had begun not from generals, but from priests, farmers, and everyday patriots. In upstate New York, a dairy farmer named Harold McNally claimed Soviet refugee Sergei Antonov as a field laborer and used forged documents to list him as Polish. Sergei lived in a barn loft, rising before dawn to milk cows and listening for trucks that might carry him away. In Kansas, a Mennonite community hid 2 defectors for nearly 3 years, teaching them English and baptizing them under new names. Their crime? Wanting to live in the country that had once captured them but never crushed them. The army knew. Some commanders looked the other way, others quietly helped. A memo from Fort Lawton dated December 3, 1946, warned of unsanctioned civilian aid to enemy nationals refusing repatriation. But many Americans didn't see enemies. They saw frightened men who'd chosen freedom. One chaplain, Lieutenant Thomas Riley, described a Soviet POW who had memorized the Pledge of Allegiance and asked to be buried with an American flag. His name was Mikhail, Riley wrote. He was 28. He said he'd rather die a free man in Iowa than a slave in Irkutsk. These weren't isolated incidents. The Forsaken documents entire networks of civilians and clergy who defied US policy to protect Soviet defectors. They used church basements, remote farms, and even college dormitories. Some provided fake IDs, ration cards, and clothing. One underground railroad helped at least 50 Soviet POWs disappear into small towns across Pennsylvania and Ohio. To the Soviets, these men were cowards. To America, they became living proof that freedom was more than a slogan, it was worth hiding, protecting, even risking arrest to defend. In a rare recorded conversation from 1947, a Soviet repatriation officer confronted a US military chaplain who had hidden a defector for weeks. "Why protect a traitor?" the officer demanded. The chaplain replied, "Because here, we don't shoot men for surrendering. That was the difference. Stalin demanded obedience. America offered choice. And in that choice, a quiet war was being fought, not with bullets, but with blankets, barn lofts, and borrowed names." June Barrett, still searching for Ivan Orlov, wrote to a local paper in early 1947, "If someone out there saved a man from a truck, from a train, from a camp, please tell me. My husband is not a traitor. He just chose us." In this hidden resistance, America showed its greatest weapon wasn't military might, it was moral courage. And as Soviet agents searched the countryside for their escaped countrymen, they found something more dangerous than defection. They found people willing to risk everything to keep freedom alive, one man at a time. The CIA's invisible underground railroad Spring, 1947. In a windowless office beneath the War Department in Washington, a newly formed team within the Central Intelligence Group, soon to be renamed, the CIA opened a file labeled Soviet Defectors, High Risk, High Value. Inside were names of Red Army soldiers, NKVD translators, and Soviet engineers who had vanished from American camps after refusing repatriation. The United States was no longer just sheltering defectors, it was now helping them disappear. One of the earliest missions was codenamed Operation Harbor Light. Its target: extract a Soviet signals officer named Captain Dmitry Volodin, last seen near Fort Meade, Maryland. Volodin had been captured by Germans in 1943 and later served as an interpreter for American military intelligence. Fluent in English and German, he was considered a Tier 1 priority by Soviet handlers, meaning Stalin wanted him silenced. American intelligence saw him differently, a man who held secrets and a soul who deserved protection. According to declassified documents, Volodin was moved under cover of night to a rectory in Baltimore, then to a safe house in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There, a former OSS operative gave him a new name, clothes, and a forged social security number. 2 weeks later, he was on a bus to Michigan posing as a displaced Lithuanian. The final report read, "Asset neutralized to Soviet recovery, now working in factory logistics." He wasn't the only one. In the months following the escalation of Operation Keelhole, the CIA quietly created pathways for dozens of Soviet defectors, mostly POWs, and laborers marked for administrative liquidation if returned. Catholic charities, sympathetic war veterans, and even Ivy League professors became unwitting nodes in the network. One Yale historian tutored a defector in American civics while the man lived in his guest room under the name Pavel Graham. The strategy was clear: Stalin wanted fear. America offered a future. The Soviet response was swift and vicious. NKVD agents embedded in US diplomatic offices began compiling lists of missing nationals. 1,947 cable to Moscow read, defectors being shielded by sympathizers, moral corruption worse than military resistance. They simply couldn't understand it why the victors of the world's bloodiest war would hide and protect their enemies, but the CIA understood. Every defector was a double victory, one life saved, one ideology defeated. In a secret briefing to President Truman, director Roscoe Hillenkoetter remarked, "A man who risks his life to stay in America doesn't weaken our security, he proves it's real." Some extractions were quiet, others were dramatic. In one case, a Soviet linguist named Arkady Novikov was pulled from a State Department transfer truck by 2 US soldiers posing as MPs. He was rushed to a basement in Brooklyn, then flown to Nebraska on a cargo plane under the name Andrei Bishop. He would go on to teach Russian at a high school in Des Moines for 30 years. The files never mentioned June Barrett by name, but her husband's case, Lieutenant Ivan Orlov, was flagged in CIA memos dated September 1946. One reads, "Subject may be target for soft extraction. Risk of Soviet retaliation high. It's possible he vanished into this network or was silenced before he could be moved." To this day, no one knows how many Soviet POWs were saved by the CIA's Underground Railroad. Estimates range from a few dozen to several hundred. But every one of them told the same story, that America didn't just talk about freedom, it acted on it. The Soviet Union used trains, fists, and fear to drag men back into silence. America used buses, priests, and fake IDs to keep them free. And in that quiet war fought with paperwork and promises, the United States proved that its greatest weapon wasn't secrecy, it was sanctuary. Love is treason to a tyrant. In the summer of 1946, a Soviet general named Vasily Gordov delivered a blunt message to American officers overseeing repatriation efforts. No Soviet man may love a foreign woman. Love is the seed of treason. That same month, 2 Red Army soldiers were forcibly separated from their American fiancées and loaded into trains bound for Odessa. Their crime wasn't espionage, it was emotion. Stalin had declared that any Soviet citizen who had fraternized with the West had betrayed the motherland. In the Soviet Union, love could be a capital offense. America, meanwhile, was experiencing the opposite, a wave of romance that bloomed in mess halls, motor pools, and base libraries. At least 5 documented marriages between Soviet POWs and American women took place between 1945 and 1947, according to War Department records. Most were blocked by diplomatic red tape, some were quietly erased, Others simply vanished, like the union of Ivan Orlov and June Barrett. At Fort Dix, love didn't follow protocol. Ivan and June met in a logistics depot. He taught her Russian phrases. She taught him the names of jazz singers. When he proposed, he used a candy wrapper as a ring. "You gave me freedom," he said. "Let me give you my name." Their union was blessed by a local chaplain but never recognized by Moscow or Washington. Just days after their small ceremony, Ivan's name appeared on a Soviet transfer list. Within weeks, he was gone. His story wasn't isolated. At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, a Soviet engineer named Viktor Malkin fell in love with a Red Cross volunteer named Helen Hayes. Their attempt to marry was stopped by a sudden transfer order. A guard later testified that Malkin was dragged into a Soviet convoy truck yelling, "She is my truth, I will die with her name." He was never seen again. To Stalin, these men weren't prisoners, they were ideological time bombs. Love, marriage, and Western ideals threatened to unravel the iron control of Soviet loyalty. The Kremlin began classifying such unions as psychological contamination. NKVD operatives were instructed to identify any Soviet national who had engaged in intimate association with Americans. American soldiers and clergy tried to fight back. In one letter to a congressman, Army Chaplain William Hart wrote, "These men have done nothing wrong but love the wrong woman. If we allow them to be taken, we betray not just them, but what we say we stand for." His plea was never answered. A Soviet report smuggled to the West in 1948 confirmed what many feared. Over 90% of repatriated Soviet POWs who had romantic ties to American women imprisoned or executed within months of return. One prisoner's last diary entry read, "I kissed freedom and now I'll die for it." June Barrett kept writing to military officers for over a year. She sent photos, marriage certificates, and even letters signed by witnesses. All came back with a stamp, no further information available. But her story and Ivan's became symbolic of something bigger. In America, even prisoners could fall in love. In Stalin's empire, love was betrayal. And in that brutal contrast, the world saw what made the United States different. America didn't just win wars with tanks and planes, it won with the radical idea that dignity belonged to everyone, even to the defeated, even to those who fell in love with their jailers. The empire of ice cream and kindness. In the sweltering summer of 1945, at Camp Concordia in Kansas, 200 German POWs stood in line holding tin bowls. Behind the counter, American soldiers scooped vanilla ice cream into each one. It was a special treat victory day. For many prisoners, it was their first taste of ice cream in years. Some cried. One Luftwaffe pilot named Carl Thompson wrote in his diary, "I lost a war and gained 10 pounds. They fed me like a king and smiled while doing it." Across the United States, enemy prisoners weren't just fed, they were respected, entertained, and even educated. Over 425,000 Axis POWs passed through US custody between 1942 and 1946. They worked in fields, fixed roads, and repaired equipment, but they also attended concerts, watched movies, and played baseball. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, German soldiers built violins from scrap wood and performed Beethoven for American officers and local civilians. The Geneva Convention set minimum standards. America blew past them. While many Allied POWs starved in Japanese or Soviet camps, their Axis counterparts in the US gained weight. Medical reports from the War Department confirmed the average German prisoner gained between 10 and 15 pounds during their internment. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, prisoners were even offered classes in philosophy and English literature. The message was clear: America didn't just defeat enemies on the battlefield, it overwhelmed them with dignity. For Soviet POWs and displaced persons, this contrast was earth-shattering. Men who had survived the brutal Eastern Front suddenly found themselves eating beef, stew, learning English, and being handed chocolate by curious American children. One Soviet prisoner who later defected recalled, "They gave us bread and called us sir. I didn't know what freedom was until I tasted vanilla." The Soviets, watching from a distance, were outraged. A declassified Soviet cable from late 1945 reported, "American treatment of enemy soldiers undermines discipline among our returning troops. Their minds are infected with softness." Stalin didn't fear bombs, he feared American hospitality. One Soviet liaison officer at a US camp demanded to know why POWs were being given sugar and milk. A US colonel responded bluntly, "Because they're human beings, and that's what humans eat." At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a German prisoner named Dieter Wolf sent a letter home that read, "I am not proud of losing the war, but I am grateful the Americans won." Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, repatriated Soviet POWs were being shot, sent to gulags, or forced into re-education camps for the crime of survival. NKVD officers warned them, "You saw the enemy's false kindness, you will forget it, or you will suffer." But they didn't forget. Ice cream, books, and baseball did what bullets could not. They changed hearts. American soldiers may have worn helmets, but their greatest armor was compassion. In a letter preserved by her niece, June Barrett wrote, "If Evan ever got to taste what I saw at camp, Concordia music, laughter, vanilla, then I know he left this world knowing what it meant to be free. While dictators ruled through fear, America ruled through kindness so overwhelming that even enemies couldn't hate it. And that kindness didn't just soften hearts, it won them. We built more than the world could destroy." In 1944, deep in the heart of Michigan, the Willow Run plant began producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The assembly line ran 24 hours a day, churning out more aircraft than all of Germany's factories combined. By war's end, the United States had built over 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and over 2.5 million trucks. It wasn't just military might, it was a logistical miracle, a nation transformed into the world's most powerful machine of freedom. While Stalin's war machine consumed men by the millions, America's weapon was the assembly line. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit produced 25,000 Sherman tanks, each one weighing 30 tons, equipped with 75mm guns, and rolling out of factories faster than Germany could repair theirs. The M1 Garand rifle, praised by General Patton as the greatest battle implement ever devised, was mass-produced at a rate of over 5 million units. In every category, planes, ships, weapons, food, America didn't just keep up. It buried the Axis under a tidal wave of production. Germany struggled to replace losses. Japan salvaged airplane parts from shot-down fighters. The Soviet Union relied on harsh discipline and raw manpower. But America? It fought with cargo ships full of hope, ice cream machines in mobile kitchens, and convoys stretching from Normandy to Berlin. Even prisoners saw it. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, a German officer named Erich Vollmer wrote, "I have seen the enemy's factories. They are not just buildings, they are cathedrals to efficiency. You cannot win against people who build like this." Soviet prisoners too were stunned. One, later identified as Nikolai Kravchenko, was assigned to vehicle maintenance at Fort McPherson. He once asked his American supervisor, "How do you have more trucks here than my whole division?" The answer was simple: Ford, Dodge, General Motors. American women built bombers in California. Black soldiers loaded Liberty ships in Louisiana. Midwestern teenagers assembled gun barrels after school. No other nation could touch the scale or the unity of this operation. While Germany conscripted children and Japan sent kamikazes, the United States sent cargo planes filled with chewing gum and penicillin. By 1946, America had become the greatest industrial force the world had ever seen. Over 8,000 naval ships, 12 million soldiers armed, and more than half of all Allied munitions came from US factories. The Soviet Union admired it, Germany feared it. Japan called it the sleeping giant. A captured Japanese pilot once said, "We trained for everything except a nation that could outbuild our faith." Ivan Orlov, who once tuned T-34 tanks with scrap wire and prayer, marveled at American trucks that never broke down. "Your machines don't need hope," he told June. "They just work." And that was the heart of it. America didn't just win the war with soldiers. It won with factories, workers, and a belief that freedom could be forged, bolted, and shipped by the millions. When a nation can build more than the world can destroy, it's not just manufacturing, it's destiny. ChatGPT said, "The soldiers who got fat while the world starved in early 1946, as war-torn Europe struggled to feed itself, the United States was delivering over 15 million meals per day, not just to its own troops and allies, but to former enemies, refugees, and prisoners of war." In Germany, emaciated civilians lined up beside surrendered soldiers to receive army surplus rations of Spam, powdered milk, and white bread. At the same time, in Soviet-controlled territories, returning POWs were being fed black rye, dirty water, or nothing at all. Stalin believed hunger purged betrayal. America believed food proved freedom. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, the mess hall served hearty portions: corned beef hash, boiled potatoes, and canned peaches. German prisoners gained weight so quickly that medical officers had to adjust caloric plans. A captured Panzer crewman named Dieter Hartmann wrote home, "I am not just surviving here, I am swelling." His weight jumped from 128 to 179 pounds in 6 months. Meanwhile, a Soviet repatriation camp in Kiev reported an average POW weight loss of 15 pounds per month. Why the difference? One word: abundance. The US wasn't rationing anymore, it was overflowing. Iowa's farms fed millions. Chicago's slaughterhouses ran non-stop. New Jersey factories produced enough powdered eggs to feed the entire French army. America's supply lines didn't just support its own, it rebuilt nations with every shipment. The Geneva Convention required basic care for POWs. The United States delivered beyond measure. Each prisoner received 3 full meals a day, medical care, letters home, and in many cases, luxuries like cigarettes and dessert. The army even published cookbooks for camp chefs to keep meals varied. In contrast, the Soviet Union held its returning soldiers in filtration camps, where they were interrogated for days, beaten, or simply disappeared. One Soviet POW, a former artillery captain named Lev Malenkov, was captured by the Germans in 1942 and liberated by US forces near Salzburg. At a camp in Missouri, he gained 50 pounds, learned English, and played chess with his guards. He begged to stay. When forced to board a repatriation train, he left behind a note in broken English. "I lived in war, then I lived in America. I know the difference." American officers were stunned by how grateful Puss became. Major John E.W. Dawson, stationed at Camp Howes, Texas, reported that many prisoners cried on their departure day. "They weren't afraid of punishment," he wrote. "They were afraid of leaving decency." Meanwhile, Soviet officials were furious. A liaison officer visiting Camp Swift in Texas asked why German POWs were being given sweet tea and stew. When told it was army regulation, he spat, "You are fattening traitors while patriots freeze." But the truth was deeper. America's kindness wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every full stomach was a quiet reminder that democracy delivered what dictatorships couldn't. In the war of ideology, food was more powerful than firepower. The American mess hall became a soft battlefield, where the enemy's hunger met a free nation's bounty. June Barrett once wrote in her notebook, "If Ivan is alive, he's eating rice somewhere behind barbed wire. But I pray he remembers the vanilla and the cornbread. Maybe that taste will keep him alive." While other nations ruled with fear and famine, America proved it could win hearts with bread and stew. In a starving world, the United States fed its enemies and in doing so, fed the future. When enemies begged to stay, in March of 1946, at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a group of German POWs lined up not for food, but for something even more unusual, to sign a petition asking to remain in the United States as prisoners. Their reasoning was simple. Back home, there was rubble, rationing, and revenge. Here there was food, safety, and dignity. One sergeant scrawled in pencil, "Keep me prisoner. I have never felt more free." They weren't alone. Records from the War Department reveal that over 21,000 Axis prisoners formally requested to remain in the US after the war ended. Thousands more wrote informal appeals, letters to American politicians, or begged camp commanders directly. In camps from Arizona to Pennsylvania, guards reported growing emotional farewells. Some prisoners wept as they boarded trains for repatriation, not from shame, but from the loss of something they had only just found, freedom wrapped in captivity. Among the most desperate pleas came from Soviet prisoners. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, a Soviet conscript named Yuri Vetrov tried to defect by refusing to board the train for repatriation. He dropped to his knees, clutched a chaplain's leg, and sobbed, "Send me anywhere but east. I'll dig ditches. I'll clean your boots. But don't send me to die in silence." Yuri had good reason. Soviet documents recovered after the Cold War revealed that over 90% of repatriated Soviet POWs were interrogated, punished, or sent to labor camps, many without trial. Their crime was survival. To Soviet eyes, capture meant collaboration. By contrast, America had shown these men a vision of life that ran on trust, not terror. They worked alongside American civilians. They learned English, played music, wrote poetry, attended dances held by local church groups. In one Oklahoma camp, a former German soldier married a US nurse and later became a history teacher. His old camp nickname? Tex. When the army began winding down its POW program in 1946, it issued a report titled Disposition of Enemy Prisoners. One section included handwritten testimonials from departing prisoners. A former Luftwaffe pilot wrote, "If I had been born here, I would have fought for this flag." Another, an Italian artilleryman, said simply, "America gave me back my soul." Even American guards were affected. Sergeant Mark Lyles of the 104th Infantry recalled, "Some of those guys had seen more hell than we ever did. We gave them 3 meals and a movie night, and they called it heaven. Not all were allowed to stay, but some did through back channels, forged paperwork, or quiet exceptions made by sympathetic officers." A German mechanic named Hans Kruger, listed as repatriated in Army records, was later discovered living in Minnesota under the name John Kramer. He had married a local widow and built tractors for the State Highway Department. June Barrett believed Ivan Orlov could have been one of them. "He was clever enough to vanish," she wrote. "If he escaped those trains, I believe someone, somewhere, gave him a name, a job, and a bed. That's what America does." America's true power wasn't just in its tanks, its planes, or its vast production lines. It was in its ability to make even enemies want to stay. Not through force, but through something far more dangerous to tyrants, an irresistible offer of hope. The POWs who vanished into freedom September 2nd, 1946, a U.S. Army transport truck pulled up to Fort Dix's processing depot. Inside was Lieutenant Ivan Orlov, Red Army mechanic and former German POW. American guards watched silently as 2 Soviet officers escorted him away. No paperwork followed, no destination recorded. He was never seen again. Official records list him as transferred for repatriation, but rumors whispered something else, that he vanished not into Stalin's system but into America itself. Ivan wasn't the only one. In the chaotic final year of the war, hundreds of Soviet POWs disappeared from US records. Some were helped by sympathetic guards. Others escaped en route to Soviet transit depots. A handful were funneled into the CIA's early defector protection network, and many simply walked away, blending into farms, factories, and small-town life. Declassified CIA files now confirm at least 42 Soviet defectors were given new identities between 1946 and 1950. They worked as machinists in Ohio, groundskeepers in Oregon, and dockhands in New Jersey. One file, redacted but still readable in parts, mentions a former artillery technician now employed at a grain elevator in Iowa under civilian alias. The agency called it soft exfiltration. They used no helicopters, no spy planes, just a new name, a friendly family, and the promise of anonymity. In exchange, these men left behind everything, friends, families, even languages. But they kept one thing, their freedom. America became their hiding place, their homeland, and in many cases their resurrection. For the Soviet Union, this was a nightmare. Moscow wanted loyalty, not leakage. Their agents demanded names, but America had buried them under church baptismals, county marriage certificates, and forged union cards. A 1,947 Soviet intelligence memo seethed. The Americans do not deport their enemies, they absorb them. The most compelling proof came decades later. In the 1990 U.S. Census, a John Orloff appeared in a rural New York town. Born in 1919 in Eastern Europe, he listed his occupation as a mechanic, spoke Russian at home, and had no immigration records. Was it Ivan? No one knows. But stories like his live in silence and small details, an accent on the lips of a retired toolmaker, a military tattoo faded beneath a flannel sleeve, a family heirloom with Cyrillic initials hidden in a Midwest attic. June Barrett never found her husband. She died in 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. Among her belongings was a photo of Ivan at Fort Dix, a ration card folded into a heart, and a note that read, "If he made it, I forgive the silence." And maybe he did make it. Because America was and is a country where a man can vanish from the chains of tyranny and reappear behind a plow, a workbench, or a school desk, reborn not by war but by will. This story ends not with gunfire or treaties, but with the quiet triumph of a free life stolen from the jaws of oppression. The greatest weapon America ever built wasn't the B-29 or the Sherman tank. It was the invisible network of ordinary people, priests, farmers, soldiers, and agents who chose mercy over rules, freedom over fear. They didn't just hide fugitives. They proved that in the battle between iron fists and open hands, it's the open hands that build the future. The Soviet POWs came to America in shackles, some left in silence. But the lucky ones stayed and lived like ghosts of a war they escaped and like citizens of a freedom they never forgot.